Propaganda, propaganda, propaganda. These days, this word is thrown at us all the time from every direction. In this video, we will explore what propaganda is, how propaganda works, and what types of propaganda are out there. We'll see how propaganda is used in times of both war and peace, and to remain impartial, we'll take examples, mostly from video games. This information will help you to look differently at both your entertainment and the real world. So, let's dive headfirst into the vortex of propaganda in video games. Let's start by defining some of our key terms. Propaganda, or communication that uses certain values or appearances to achieve a certain end, has been part of human culture since the beginning, but as a term, it has been defined and studied comparatively recently. In itself, propaganda can take advantage of people's values to give them either a positive or negative impression. We can get a better understanding of propaganda by analyzing its origins in the ancient history of human civilizations. In tribes of the first sentient humans, shamans and chiefs told horrific tales about their savage enemies, who were actually very similar. They might accuse them of eating infants, drinking the blood of fallen enemies, or worshiping demons from the underworld. If you grow up in a society which brainwashes you with these ideas, you're bound to buy into them sooner or later, no matter how skeptical you are. We can see this phenomenon at work in primitive tribes that still exist today, and we have no reason to think that our own ancestors were any more, let's say, humanistic. Knowing that, it's no surprise that archaeologists think that 2/3 of all human deaths in the Stone Age were the result of wars. Of course, these conflicts were mostly local and may have only involved a few hundred fighters, but given the small population of humanity at the time, it's safe to say that war played a major role in wiping out a huge percentage of our first upright sentient ancestors. This early use of propaganda in warfare is brought to life, though in a trashy and fantastical way, in Xenoclash. Our tribe's creepy antagonist is a genderless creature who acts as a parent or chief of the tribe. He, or it, brainwashes the young, including the children that it steals from other tribes. The art of brainwashing is also exemplified in Age of Mythology by the Cyclops Gargarensis, a figure based on Greek myth. He has lured soldiers from different nations to fight in his campaign to free the Titan Kronos. He lies, manipulates, conceals obvious facts, basically uses the techniques of propaganda to convince others to help him achieve his goal. His forces of men and sentient beasts are recruited from Greece, Egypt, and Scandinavia. All of this is similar to the historical example of the Ottoman Empire, who recruited the enslaved children of the Christians to fight in their armies. These foreign soldiers were converted to Islam and subjected to prolonged training and education, brainwashing them to serve the needs of the empire. They became the elite fighting force known as the Janissaries. Albanians, Armenians, Bosnians, Bulgarians, Greeks, and Georgians trained to fight against the forces of their motherlands. You can command these very troops in the real-time strategy game series Age of Empires. Having these forces kills two strategic birds with one stone. You bolster your own forces and demoralize your enemy, who must fight against their own.
The Crusades are dead! Your knighthood is all that remains!
Before we dive even deeper into the topic of war propaganda, let's take a look at a few non-military examples, since propaganda can include any type of argument to shape public opinion to achieve the propagandist's goal. If the propagandist has a positive goal, then it could be as simple as promoting a healthy lifestyle choice. Let's take a bit of a strange example from BioShock Infinite, set sometime in the early 20th century. In that time, there was somebody smoking, chewing, or snuffing tobacco everywhere you looked. Researchers have only just started to claim that these activities are dangerous, but some doctors claim to have proof that smoking is good for everyone, even children. Remember that in real civilized countries, it is illegal for advertisements to claim that a product has some positive effect unless it has been scientifically proven. But they had it easier in the cloudy, floating city of Colombia. As the main character strolls around, The player can see young boys wheedling money from their parents, buying cigarettes with them, and stand around in groups, leisurely smoking and comparing cigarette brands. There's even a special brand for children, Minor Victory. Kinetoscopes, machines that played short, silent videos, show an advertisement where a father buys cigarettes for his son, who happily smokes them. It's easy for us to think that this was just greedy capitalists foisting harmful products on a gullible public. But during that era, even in the real world, cigarettes were looked at like a vitamin or a medicine. In the 19th century, doctors even prescribed cigarettes to protect against harmful miasms. The situation was similar with opium, which was viewed as a fashionable tranquilizer. You may wonder, how is advertising any different from propaganda if you're using one as an example of the other? That is a difficult question. Theorist Leo J. Margolin would have answered the question in this way. To embed an idea in a consumer that he must chew only a specific type of chewing gum, or to drive a car only of a certain make, is propaganda, which doesn't much differ from that which is used to sell the soldiers or population of hostile country the idea of capitulation by proving their situation being hopeless. As for non-military propaganda of a more negative type, let's take the excellent example from the survival game Frostpunk. The story of this game takes place in an alternative version of the 19th century, where global cooling is threatening humanity with the new ice age. The player leads a group of survivors. At a certain moment, the group is gripped by panic and begins to think of rebelling against the captain. At this point, two propaganda doctrines come to the rescue, either faith or discipline. Each of them, when used wisely, can rally the people together behind the goal of surviving. It gives them a sense of purpose that allows them to set aside their petty fears and differences in order to continue the struggle to save the human species. If we analyze the discipline doctrine, we can see that it is characterized by the elements of military life, forming up in the mornings, rallying speeches, watchtowers, militia patrols. The group takes on the appearance of a military, even though they're not going to fight an actual war. Many of the aspects of military life take center stage: hierarchy, authority, collective will, and hostility towards those who don't conform. One way or the other, the image of an internal enemy that must be exterminated captures the imagination of the city, and the citizens rally against it in order to maintain unity in their fight against the environment. Personal needs become irrelevant, and humanitarian concerns no longer matter. With a high level of discipline or faith, the population is motivated to crush the rebellious minority, physically and morally. Which is why, even if you weather the storm, the game asks you one final question. The city survived, but was it worth it? At last, let's get to our main topic, war propaganda. What is it, and how does it work? Along with every military conflict goes the propaganda war. Its goal is to affect the enemy's thoughts, including soldiers and civilians, to demoralize or pacify them by twisting the facts or to achieve some other military objective. These days, the term hybrid warfare is on everybody's lips because propaganda can be actively used to target and destabilize an enemy country without ever sending a single troop. But there's no need to depict that here. In general, the definition of war propaganda seems more like formality, and actual battles don't have to be a determining factor or even an essential element.
Yelling out to him.
Theories about propaganda wars are regularly discussed in military academies and taught to officers. For obvious reasons, we can't get our hands on much of that information. But a generally accessible article that demonstrates the point is What is Battle Propaganda? By Vladimir Yakovlev, published on May 18, 2015. Perhaps if you spend enough time digging around on the internet, you can find a more detailed analysis. But that is to train specialists to create or counteract battle propaganda. Yakovlev specifically identifies several of the most popular methods of propaganda: the 60-40 rule, rotten herring, absolute obviousness, and strict censorship. Just as he demonstrates these techniques in real life, we'll show examples of how they function in video games.
My fellow citizens of the world, today you are afraid. You are afraid because you have been woken from your sleep.
Specific methods of battle propaganda. In the tactical strategy game XCOM 2, you can observe how alien invaders employ a variety of battle propaganda techniques against the population of our planet in order to assimilate humanity and strengthen their empire. Let's analyze how they apply the 60-40 rule. Designed during World War II, the point of this technique is to use 60% positive propaganda to entice the enemy and earn his trust. Once the enemy trusts you, the remaining 40% is used to deceive the enemy by providing deceptive information to manipulate them to your will. In about 60% of the alien propaganda found in the game, they describe the incredible heights that humans can achieve with them: medicine, science, art, and culture. In the remaining 40%, they promote two parallel ideas. The humans rebelling against alien rule are terrorists who must be eliminated, betrayed, and obstructed by any means necessary. Also, humans should hurry to the alien medical centers to receive life-extending treatments. Do we even need to mention what these medical centers actually are? Facilities to convert human civilians into biofuel or genetically modified soldiers to bolster the alien army forces.
Meine Damen und Herren, wir haben ihn!
We can observe a similar theme in The New Colossus. The Nazis make use of cinema, newspapers, radio, and television to ostracize rebel groups and brainwash the masses. Clashes with rebels are portrayed in a way that strongly favors the occupiers. During the game, we see newspapers and communications that clearly demonstrate how the truth is twisted and how believable propaganda is mixed in. The Third Reich never misses an opportunity to promote its version of events. They even stoke internal division by supporting racist groups, the Ku Klux Klan for one. Dissenting viewpoints are violently oppressed, while the population is forced to study the greatness of German culture and language. Another vivid example comes from the many communities of survivors in the Metro 2033 series. The first plot arc features a confrontation between fascists and communists. Propagandists and orators on both sides fling mud at one another, mixing in plenty of lies, slander, and fictional crimes committed by their opponent. They stir up so much hysteria that the population gets more and more violent, and this eventually leads to a global confrontation with all of the citizens of the underground. They use propaganda to effectively muddy the waters so much that nobody even knows what their own commanders' true plans are.
Where are you going?
Stop him!
The Mass Effect franchise also features this method. In this game, xenophobic organizations make appeals to the precedent of the First Contact War of 2157 to further their cause. During this conflict that stretched all the way into outer space, Turians had occupied the human colony of Shanxi. Eventually, the Alliance was able to liberate the colony, and the Citadel Council was able to intervene and avert a full-scale war. This incident provides the core of the propaganda campaign of the Terra Firma political party and the paramilitary group Cerberus. They accuse the aliens of creating the current conflict as part of their ongoing plan to brutalize mankind, while the Alliance sits by and does nothing to protect them. The player learns that in reality, the Turians are following intergalactic law and simply trying to prevent humans from activating the device called a mass relay. In this example, about 60% of the propaganda spread by humans portrays the undeniable aggressive actions taken by the aliens, but the remaining 40% consists of conspiracy theories regarding the Turians plotting with the Council against humanity. This 1-2 propaganda punch attracts many undecided groups to their cause. Next, let's look at another potent trick called the rotten herring. You can witness this technique as you follow the path of Geralt of Rivia, the representative of the Witchers in the series of the same name. How do you employ the rotten herring? The technique centers around selecting a single, scandalous accusation, true or false. In the case of the Witchers, it is that they steal children and eat them, in addition to copulating with monsters and committing other inhuman acts. everywhere you go, the protagonist is faced with this slander. Because the lie is so sensational, truth becomes irrelevant. The goal of a rotten herring is to spread it as far and wide as possible. Human nature handles the rest. So-called experts, witnesses, then followers and fanatics quickly fall in line. The defenders can shout the truth from the rooftops, but nobody will listen when the lie is so much more exciting. Of course, humans' natural prejudice against outsiders is what makes the rotten herring so effective. This is why, in the game's third part, the cult of Eternal Flame can emerge as such a powerful force into the political arena. They stoke the public's resentment and prejudice, leading to even more hatred of witchers, as well as sorceresses and all sentient non-humans like dragons. And this is where the real fun begins. The rumors about witchers are continuing to fly all around. Now, every witcher becomes a marked man. As soon as one enters a settlement, the immediate response is, "Aren't you here to steal our children? Get out of here, you abomination! Your kind are not welcome here," and so on. Brawls erupt in taverns, leading to predictable outcomes for the peasants, making the stench of the rotten herring cling ever closer to Geralt and his colleagues, even when they were only defending themselves. Only when the village is later at the mercy of some monster do they finally call for the Witcher, who must hold his nose, do his job, and rescue the people who hate him. It's no wonder then that when Geralt is his typical altruistic self, the characters usually react with surprise. According to their worldview, a Witcher is a heartless killing machine, devoid of human empathy and compassion. It should be said that not everything Geralt does works against myth. Of course, the best propagandists combine these methods to be even more effective, such as the freedom fighters, counterintelligence forces who use both the 60-40 rule and the rotten herring methods. Our story takes place when Soviet Russia invades the United States. Right away, the invaders capture the telecommunication systems, replacing the channels with the SAFN, broadcasting the greatness of the Soviet civilization. But by the second mission, the player witnesses a report portraying rebels as cruel, psychopathic terrorists rather than liberators. The invading army takes their own abominable acts and displays them as if they'd been committed by the rebels, who are portrayed as enemies of their own countrymen. This deceptive 40% also fulfills the purpose of a rotten herring, which is to turn the public masses against your enemy. One of the oldest and most potent tricks in the book is known as absolute obviousness. In Divinity Original Sin 2, some characters are known as sorcerers who bear an extremely rare and powerful gift. Their very existence poses a threat to the divine order Magisters, who dominate the fictional world. The Magisters speak of the sorcerers as though the danger they present is an obvious fact, something to be taken for granted. Although the highest ranks of the order clearly understand the truth is not so simple, the idea of doing anything other than isolating and exterminating the sorcerers is viewed as an unnecessary risk and not worth considering. As a result, the player gets the impression that the overwhelming majority of people are basically on the same page. Source carriers and their allies are universally stigmatized. As a result, the player regularly sees that source carriers are met with apprehension, torture, and execution everywhere they go. Sermons and books portray them as ruling over spawns of darkness that are a danger to everyone. The masses are pressured to follow along with the mainstream narrative until this fabricated idea becomes their reality. Another interesting example comes from Far Cry 5, in which a character's narration demonstrates almost unconscious use of absolute obviousness. Antagonist Joseph Seed's depiction of himself as a prophet is treated as absolutely obvious, when in reality he's suffering from a delusion brought on by mental illness. This is known as a religious delusion to psychiatrists in official diagnostics, as seen in the DSM and the updated International Classification of Diseases set to be released in 2022. In this case, we're dealing with a type of religious delusion known as a Messiah complex, in which a person is convinced that they have been given a divine mission. Joseph Seed is so convinced of his status that he is able to indoctrinate the citizens of Hope County until they believe his every word. By treating his Messiah status as absolutely obvious, he found big success at this. People who enter his sect are not afraid to kidnap, steal, resist armed law enforcement, or commit any other illegal act at the snap of Seed's finger. They truly and absolutely believe that Joseph's seed speaks to them with the very voice of God. In addition to spreading false information, another tool that could be considered a form of war propaganda is removing information through strict information censorship. Let's take a look at some vivid examples from video games. Arcturus Mengsk, the Emperor of Dominion in StarCraft II, is able to deftly use mass media to achieve his aims. He can masterfully filter all of the information being broadcast by the UNN network in the world of the Terrans. At the same time, he uses his own networks to disseminate propaganda following the 60-40 rule and spreading rotten herrings to the public at large and to Jim Raynor in particular. In this way, Mengsk's totalitarian regime stays afloat by removing the truth about its cruel governance. One of Raynor's campaign missions requires him to overcome this firewall of censorship created by the Emperor. By capturing the central note of the UNN information network, he broadcasts a compromising recording of Arcturus himself that shows his real attitude towards his subjects, causing the Dominion civilians and militias to revolt. In all its forms, effective propaganda has a deep psychological influence that cannot be reversed by merely logical counter-arguments. The best propaganda creates an emotional wound or trigger that subverts the subject's thought processes. The method of absolute obviousness does this by creating a strong, presupposed mental connection. Rotten herring works similarly by connecting the object of the propaganda to the scandalous accusation.
You know, I love seeing him squirm, but the Dominion's just gonna spin this like they do everything else.
Not this time. Mengsk used the media as a weapon for years, and now we've turned it against him.
Game developers mostly follow a similar pattern when demonstrating the effects of battle propaganda, attributing it most often to secret societies or government agencies. The Deus Ex game series features the Illuminati in this role. They nimbly rally the supporters, or pure humanity, to oppose the rights of augmented humans. Global information networks, government agencies, and terrorist organizations serve as the medium for their message. You can observe the same pattern in the Assassin's Creed series, where the Order of the Templars, with its millennial history, plays a similar part. Uses of ordinary and war propaganda in video games as a gameplay mechanic. Now that we understand the forms of war propaganda, let's analyze how propaganda works as a gameplay mechanic that players can control. This idea can best be seen in turn-based strategy games. Stellaris is a 4X grand strategy series about space exploration and empire building, centered around a sentient race created by the player, which can be an organic or synthetic species. The player has many types of technologies and actions at their disposal by which they can influence their own population and alien ones. As the player's empire expands, it's commonly faced with situations where existing habitations receive an inflow of another species. Naturally, this can create a conflict between the rights and interests of both kinds of inhabitants. If fundamentally different types of species try to coexist, like intelligent communitarian mushrooms receiving an influx of brutish, authoritarian lizardmen, the player can use propaganda as a way to preserve the stability of the regime. Or the player can use more aggressive methods to assimilate a primitive species. For example, by building an orbiting broadcasting station that promotes scientific progress, or by intervening in the race's political structure by replacing their leaders with replicas to carry out your agenda. When you're at war with another species, you can propagandize your own population to reinforce their hatred of the enemy, which, in turn, gives a power boost to your ground troops. When it comes to using a diversity of ordinary and military propaganda techniques, Stellaris is one of the best games out there. In contrast, the Total War series demonstrates a more primitive system of propaganda, centered around the following objectives. 1. Spreading the dominant culture to assimilate conquered settlements and nations. The player can issue directives, or establish outposts to achieve this purpose. 2. Pacifying rebellious settlements, perhaps by easing taxes or through a show of force by constructing and reinforcing military garrisons. 3. Sedition against enemy governments, carried out by influence agents and the great people. In this franchise, the player must carry out the objective mostly with these straightforward tools. Player versus propaganda as a gameplay mechanic. Most of the time, the player fights against the effects of propaganda, but attacking its root cause can be just as effective. In the previously mentioned Far Cry series, the player counters propaganda by destroying radio repeaters and watchtowers. The developers may have been inspired by a historical example. From 1993 to 1994, the nation of Rwanda was subject to the infamous Free Radio of 1,000 Hills, which became known as the Radio of Hatred. The radio was officially created to facilitate harmonic social development, but in fact, the radio programming took an overt stance to incite conflict between the Hutu and Tutsi ethnic groups, leading the former to attempt to exterminate the latter. Well-known slogans included "chop down the high trees" and "exterminate the cockroaches." Such propaganda contributed greatly to the genocide of the Tutsis on a massive scale. This most closely resembles the situation found in Far Cry 4, where similar slogans are found in the propaganda of the tyrannical king Pagan Min. In both cases, the propaganda proved effective. Regions that were not reached by the broadcasts, or where it's been jammed, witness fewer hate crimes and murders. Of course, we don't know whether the developers of Far Cry were directly inspired by the case in Rwanda, and don't want to create a conspiracy theory, but as they say, art imitates life.
Listen, candles are now illegal. What? Yes, all of them. Treason punishable by death. Thank you.
These effects of propaganda are vividly stylized in the mechanics of sector liberation from Nazi occupation in the open-world game The Saboteur. When the Third Reich enters Paris, the world turns black and white, creating a noir atmosphere like movies of the era or Sin City. When the player liberates an area, it regains its color, while the areas that remain under the sway of Nazi propaganda, emanating from loudspeakers and watchtowers, remain shrouded in the colorless noir. Assassin's Creed expands on the tactics and mechanics of propaganda elimination as the player strikes down Templar influence agents and physically tears down images encouraging the public to betray the assassins and their operatives. In the third part, the player can fight against the attempt to create those postings in the first place.
Oh yay! Oh yay! Word has reached us that the man responsible for today's shooting may have been in disguise.
With this in mind, let's take a closer look at how destruction of symbols affects propaganda. The influence of a person or group is often built into the art and architecture of a city. In games, this creates a more immersive atmosphere. Consider, for example, Comstock's statues in the world of BioShock Infinite and the atmosphere they create. They symbolize the extent of our adversary's power in this world. This creates realism because we can see this reflected in our surroundings. Regimes erect visibly striking structures, often of massive scale and made of stone or concrete, which loom over the people and influence them on an unconscious level. Consider the Motherland Calls statue, the Cross of the Valley of the Fallen, or the Statue of Liberty. One can't help but stand in awe beneath them. Imagine the influence of the Statue of Liberty on the millions of immigrants sailing to Ellis Island in New York City. This is exactly the atmosphere that Andrew Ryan's bust and Comstock's statue are meant to impart on the player who enters the BioShock Infinite world for the first time. Sometimes the player can influence this world of structural propaganda. The first Terran mission in StarCraft II gives the player the opportunity to destroy Arcturus Mengsk's holographic stands, just as in Just Cause 2, we can detonate the statues of the dictator Baby Panay. When it comes to game mechanics, vivid examples of propagandistic architecture can also be seen in Tropico and SimCity. The former features many famous statues, while the latter allows the player to influence the world by creating specific types of communities. While a democratic city may look similar to the metropolises of today, The player may also choose to build something that seems to come straight out of the movie Equilibrium, complete with forced injections to keep the civilian population docile and obedient. Let's consider how this thinking can help us analyze reality in terms of a popular but false maxim: an ideology should be discussed separately from the people who carry it out. This idea simply is not correct. If we review any political theory separately from the movements that it created, it will certainly appear utopian and beneficial. The obvious example is Marxist communism. As soon as you look at the actual people who have advanced this ideology and how they went about it, well, let's just say that reality should be the standard of truth rather than theory. As soon as leaders decide to carry out their vision by force, no matter how beautiful that vision was, the veil of innocence will instantly fall off. No man can reign innocently. Ideologies should not be thought of as separate from the blood that was spilt in their name. Considering the theories without this context, we won't say that doing so is stupid, but it definitely misses an important point. Just try discussing the realities of married life with a young teen who hasn't started dating yet. You'll get a similar result.
Change is good. Embrace it. Your king is alive. Rejoice.
Let's take another example of Nazi symbolism, this time in the Wolfenstein relaunch. The effect of the symbolism is to create a feeling of hopelessness by reminding us of the evil we're fighting against. It creates an oppressive atmosphere. However, there is a big but to all of this. While many modern countries forbid political demonstrations using this iconography, let's not forget that the swastika itself is an ancient symbol dating back to the Paleolithic age and found particularly in ancient India. We can't even list all of the groups, causes, and peoples that it symbolized before the 20th century. Yet, just try to find someone whose primary association with the symbol is anything other than Hitler and his Holocaust, except maybe a practitioner of Orthodox Hinduism in Indochina. The same goes for whatever your favorite ideology is: communism, capitalism, anarchism, authoritarianism, and so on. Always remember that people will associate the theory with the most vivid and recent example, and will associate those who hold the ideology with that as well. We can leave the rest to academics. This is why that moment from freedom fighters depicting the struggle against Soviet occupation resonated with many. We lower the flags of the Soviet forces, taking away the symbols of the occupiers. This is reinforced when new recruits rally to our cause. The camera angles in these scenes are reminiscent of the famous photo of the Soviet flag being hoisted above the Reichstag. Intentional or not, we can't separate the fiction from reality, just as in the event of Watchtowers. As the narration unfolds, it's mixed up in our minds with the fight of the Allies and the Red Army against the Axis powers of World War II. While this might be more of a stereotype held by those in the West, it still remains potent, as memories of the Cold War and the Cuban Missile Crisis won't be going away anytime soon. So we also can't help but mention an example that was disastrous in almost every sense, but filled with the mechanics of propaganda warfare in Homefront: The Revolution. The narration presents us with an alternate timeline where North Korea leads an alliance of Asian countries that have occupied the United States. Many of the themes from this video are present: sector liberation, resistance strongholds, the targeting of enemy operatives, rescuing grateful citizens, and a spreading guerrilla insurgency, all taking place against a backdrop of global and local censorship and propaganda as the occupiers attempt to sway the masses to their side. The protagonist's band of rebels is completely outmatched in terms of resources, which also gives the campaign the atmosphere of a survival game. But the game shows the difficulty of implementing these good, complex ideas, and it was panned by critics for its gameplay aspects. We would say that the endless series of similar watchtowers and points of interest was to blame. Ubisoft eventually abandoned this idea after it was panned by critics. Despite the poor execution, this game took us as close as we've gotten to a complete player versus propaganda experience, and what a masterpiece it could have been, in theory at least. Unfortunately, We haven't been spoiled just yet with a great tool set to wage our own propaganda war in a video game. Propaganda is hard enough to fight in real life, and it's almost just as hard to create a YouTube video that does the topic justice without getting ourselves into some hot water, when you consider what topics we've been covering and the questionable lexicon associated with them. So, that's why we ask you to leave us some thoughtful comments. And if you're feeling generous, like this video and share it and subscribe for more like this. And, of course, thank you for giving us your attention.